Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the British Columbia Museums Association webinar. My name is Lorenda Calvert, and I will be your host for today. Today's webinar topic is #Museums are not neutral, white supremacy in museums and calls to immediate action. Our webinar today is presented by Sharanjit Kaur Sandhra, pronouns she, her, and Sharn has included her email address here if you would like to reach her after this webinar. As I mentioned, my name is Lorenda Calvert. I am the program coordinator with the BC Museums Association. My pronouns are she, her. If you require any assistance with this webinar, you can reach us at operations@museumsassociation.bc.ca. Now, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the BCMA offices are located on the traditional lands of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. We are grateful for the opportunity to live and learn here in mutual respect and appreciation. We also recognize the traditional lands of the many nations across British Columbia where the work of the project described in this webinar have been carried out. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank our webinar sponsor today, Lucidia. Lucidia is a software solutions company based in Richmond, BC. They develop collections management software systems that are suitable for libraries, archives, and museums, both large and small. Lucidia's motto is redefine how knowledge is shared, which is quite fitting for a webinar sponsor. We thank Lucidia for supporting BCMA as we seek to share knowledge through our webinar series. We are streaming live to Facebook as well as here on Zoom, and we do have someone moderating the Facebook live stream if you have questions or comments. Now, a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. If you were reading this slide and hearing me talk, you were doing great. If you can't, don't show it at your screen because we won't be able to hear you. Simply use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. It may be hidden, so if you hold your mouse either at the top or bottom of your screen, the feature menu should emerge. You can use the chat feature to ask questions or make comments. I will read your comments or questions out to our host. The presentation today may take up most of the time we've had scheduled, and we do hope to have some time at the end for questions and discussions. Sharn has included her email, as I mentioned, in the first screen, and we will be circulating that email in our post-webinar resource link so that you can reach out to her. As I mentioned, today's presenter is Sharanjit Kaur Sandhra, coordinator of the South Asian Studies Institute at the University of the Fraser Valley. And Sharn, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that you can take over. Thank you so much for joining me here today. Let me just stop my screen.
Thanks, Lorenda. Thank you for all your help. You've been a joy to work with and set this up, and I'm really excited. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging that I am living on the unceded territory of the Stolo peoples, the people of the river. I want to acknowledge the systemic and state violence that have existed against Indigenous peoples in Canada since the moment white settlers stole the lands we are on. I want to acknowledge my culpability in this displacement as a Punjabi Sikh settler here. I want to make clear that since April alone, the RCMP and our police force have killed the following Indigenous people: Aisha Hudson, Jason Collins, Stuart Kevin Andrews, Everett Patrick, Chantel Moore. I acknowledge that some of us are gathered here under the call and charge from the Black Lives Matter movement, and in solidarity against police brutality and institutional oppression, suppression, and negation. I raise my hands to my Indigenous brothers and sisters who continue to fight and resist and fight and resist. And now these communities are forced into ongoing museum repatriation conversations, ongoing for decades as part of institutions that continue to hide behind their own bureaucracies and walls of capital wealth, condescension, hypocrisy, and negation. I initially had thought that I'd spend half an hour or so talking and then taking time for questions. But no, I have been given a platform to speak my truth, to speak the truth for so many Black, Indigenous people of color. From now on, I'll be saying BIPOC, though my opinion certainly is not representative of all of theirs. I'll be using up most of the hour, if not a little bit more, though I'll try really hard not to. So I'm going to speak today from a place of knowledge, from a place of history, from a place of my lived experience, and I assure you, you will be very uncomfortable. But you have to decide in this moment whether you're going to stay in your discomfort, deflect, accuse me of being anti-white, or think in your head that there's reverse racism happening, becoming defensive, or are you in this moment as museum professionals, curators of culture, community, history, and power, going to choose to change the very foundations upon which you and the institutions you work for are built upon? I leave that question with you, your internal organizations, and each other. I don't care if you're uncomfortable, Because for centuries, Indigenous Black people of color have been in discomfort from the very spaces you work in, from the very spaces that you curate in and the design exhibits in and collect artifacts in. We have been uncomfortable for centuries, so 1 hour of discomfort will do nothing to you. The real indication will be what you do with that discomfort going forward. Which begs a further question of who's listening to me right now? Are the Jack Lomans of the museums world listening to this right now? Are the white CEOs and leaders of some of the most powerful museums in British Columbia, the head curators at the MOA, the MOV, listening to me right now? The cynic in me is going to say no, because they have their other staff members to do that for them, right? Because why invest in spending an hour to hear from the lived experience of someone who also happens to be doing her PhD in public history, museums, and critical race theory, and is an activist, when you can just get disattached sound bites from your staff? Therein also lies the problem. Those who can make the most impact aren't even listening. I'd like to acknowledge how this webinar came to be. I'm a council member with the BC Museums Association, and at our last meeting, I called out the BCMA on what I felt was a very weak statement from the BCMA in response to Black Lives Matter and the race revolution taking place all around us. I'm lucky that I'm surrounded by council members who heard me speak from my heart in that moment, acknowledged me, agreed with me, and thus this conversation came to be. We ended up having a wonderful philosophical conversation about who we were and what is our purpose. I wonder how many museums actually say and do this regularly. I also want to say that I actually can say the things I'm about to say today because I have no investment in working in the museum sector. So whether you hire me or not makes no difference to me. So just think about that. Think about all the BIPOC artists, students, curators, designers, academics, archivists who can't speak, because they know that if they do, they'll potentially lose any chance at being hired by you. Because who wants a Black, Indigenous, person of color artist or curator with a voice, right? We just want someone who can spout institutional rhetoric. I'd like to begin by sharing with you some actual things that have been said to me in my academic career and museum professional career over the past 6 years in particular. So Lorenda, can you jump in and let me know if people can see the PowerPoint? Because I have double screens here.
We can see the PowerPoint. It's not slideshow. It's just showing what the PowerPoint would look like before you actually make it a full slideshow.
Perfect. Awesome. So these are the things that have been said to me in a matter of 6 years. Sharn, don't be the angry Black girl in the room. When asking a museum ED about their all-white staffing, we were told, well, we're not going to fire all our white staff if that's what you're looking for. We've been told, well, I'm 10% Indigenous, so ... says a visibly white-looking person in a position of power when calling on their privilege. I've been told that I do not belong in a certain department. I've been told, well, you know, students tend to prefer to learn about European history. I've been told, well, they, insert any BIPOC community here, just don't come into our museum no matter how much we try. I'm mentioning this to highlight how deeply entrenched racist ideals and racism is within the museum sector and within academia. Let me tell you why they don't want to come into your museum by showing you a very short clip from the greatest Marvel movie of all time, The Black Panther. Of course, I'm very mindful of not perpetuating idealistic tropes of the non-existent Wakanda as being some sort of ideal holistic Africa. I'm showing this simply because of its museum scene. So I'm going to stop and show you that museum scene. This film scene, in less than 3 minutes, offers a look into what some experiences of being in museums is like. European museums are the absolute worst, but we are no better because Canadian museums, much like Canadian histories, hide ourselves under a guise of inclusivity, peace building, and lowercase l liberalism. Everything about this movie scene is an example of what we BIPOC feel entering your spaces. We feel the sanitized whiteness of your boxed artifacts. We feel that we are being told about us through your white gaze. We feel that we are being watched by your security or docents. And we feel the white condescension, just like the white female in this video clip demonstrates. We feel the burden of legacies of colonialism. So no, let me make this very clear. I don't care whether you have 10 white curators or artists and leaders who have done their PhDs on communities they are not a part of. Until you diversify completely and holistically your museum space from the top to the bottom to the bilateral, your museum and your curators and your artists will never be able to make your museum space inviting for us. Never. Full stop. Never. Until we become hired as a part of the process, as leaders in the process who are nurtured and acknowledged, including our critiques of you, until that happens in your museum spaces, your spaces will never be welcome places for us. This is the revolution we are in. This is the movement we are in. In his book, Discourse on Colonialism, Amy Césaire wrote, quote, "It would have been better not to have needed them, that Europe would have done better to tolerate the non-European civilization at its side, leaving them alive, dynamic, and prosperous, whole and not mutilated, that it would have been better to let them develop and fulfill themselves than to present for our admiration, duly labeled, their dead and scattered parts. The museum by itself is nothing, that it means nothing, that it can say nothing, when smug self-satisfaction rots the eyes, when a secret contempt for others withers the heart, when racism, admitted or not, dries up sympathy," end quote. What Amy Césaire said in 1950 still stands today. Those who are not BIPOC need to feel a bit of discomfort in this, because you need to know where many of us are at in terms of our utter exhaustion, our utter strength, and our utter exasperation. When I continue to hear again and again and again, well, they don't engage with us, they don't come into our museums, they don't respond when we reach out, they don't respond when we ask them to do unpaid work as committee members and advisors, they don't respond. Good, I'm glad they don't respond. Why should they respond when you have spent the entire time since your inception obsessing about white settler histories, collecting objects of white settler histories, collecting oral histories of white settler histories, of engaging with the archives on white settler histories? A museum has never been a space for BIPOC. It has never been a space for our voice, our experience, our culture, our history, our language. It is your space to write about us and to continue on with the legacies of colonialism under the guise of inclusion, diversity, equity, and community building. Let's revisit now some of these colonial foundations upon which the museum stands upon. I'm a believer in historical foundations as a guide to us in this moment, and I truly feel that some of us have actually forgotten those foundations. So let's have a look again, shall we? The collection of objects, the accumulation and theft of cultural wealth based on the explorations of the 15th to 18th centuries are intimately tied to the, quote, Enlightenment, an age of the public museum in the second half of the 18th century. Compared to the first museums of the 17th century as cabinets of curiosities, however, these new public institutions heightened the link of structure to chronology. Chronology considered as both genealogy and evolutionary progress. Evolutionary progress then, including the evolution of human species, was a core component of the public museums in the 18th century. In the same historical moment that the European Public Museum focused on the public consumption of collections and objects, explorers like James Cook was accumulating cultural objects. The travel of James Cook marked a significant shift in the process from which museums first began to contribute to a creation of race as a historical category. Cook's explorations were unique compared to other explorers before him because he was less interested in privateering and more interested in the science of mapping, natural history, and navigational knowledge. It would be the connection to knowledge building which correlates to the formation of race as a historical category. The global reach of Cook's world explorations and subsequent gathering or stealing of cultural objects was quite staggering, with objects from the Canadian Pacific Northwest and New Zealand being showcased in Scottish and British museums, thus shaping knowledge and racial constructs across continents. Cook's sharing of Maori artifacts in particular was considered an indispensable tool to the production of knowledge, as a means of bringing Maori and Europeans within reach of each other and in defining the nature of their relations. Cook's travels, his collections, and the subsequent display were also part of the world of, quote, gentlemen collectors, and Europeans' men's scientific and aesthetic interests. Thus, the possession of artifacts becomes a narrative of power beyond borders and into global realms, while reifying the power of, in this case, colonial Britain. Public displays of collections based on explorations were also a part of a merging of science and in the arts in the 18th century. In the same historical moment that Cook was traveling across seas and continents, forging a legacy and stealing artifacts for display, European scientists were also theorizing concepts of race. The concept of race itself began with the classification and study of plants and would later be used as a means to classify humans. In 1770, the same year that Cook was engaging in its explorations of the northwest coast of Canada, German anatomist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach used skull shapes to divide Homo, into the 5 divisions of Malaysian, American, Ethiopian, Mongolian, and Caucasian. Edward Said suggests that the classification from nature to man marked a 4th element preparing the way for modern Orientalist structures, as it would turn into physiological moral classification. The movement from physiological to moral classification can be attributed in part to scientists like polygenist Christoph Meiners, who in 1785 extended the categories of race to argue, quote, for an animality of the ugly races, end quote, suggesting that only Caucasians deserve the epithet of beauty. Beauty as a marker of higher morality was another defining feature of theories on race in which whiteness, and for the purpose of this talk, white art and aesthetics become equated with beauty and higher morale, whilst non-whiteness becomes attributed to a lower morality. In the late 18th century, with Cook's travels, the discovery, quote, discovery of new cultures, artifacts, traditions, and belief systems, in concert with European scientific theories which sought to classify such differences, converged and contributed significantly to museum discourse on race as a carefully constructed historical category. The collection and display of objects taken during explorations and their subsequent inclusion into various museums added an element of spectacle, in which, quote, the museum placed its visitors at the center of the world to be known and possessed, end quote. Visitors of these European museums were given an objective vision in which compartmentalized worlds became the representations of difference, including cultural, racial, and gendered differences. The concept of the spectacle in relation to the museum gained momentum in the late 19th century through opportunities of movement via the steamship. Artifacts and collections displayed Aboriginal, African, and Asian cultures in particular traversed borders and boundaries as part of world fairs and intercolonial exhibits in Europe and the US in particular, creating an essential, quote, race on show, quote, end quote, effect. Penelope Edmonds argues that, quote, the intercolonial exhibit provided a fascinating optic through which to examine the transformations of colonizing bourgeois metropolis ideas about Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism and the co-fashioning of white Anglo-Saxon subjects and Aboriginal subjects, end quote. Not only did the spectacle of such intercolonial exhibits feed a burgeoning metropolitan class, it also reified the differences between the white Anglo-Saxon and those on display. The use of mannequins in such world tours or exhibits, for example, linked the museum to the unfettered spectacle of empire and forged a certain visual fascination with the exotic body. The 1893 Chicago World Fair was another example in which, by commemorating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's supposed discovery of America, also introduced millions of fairgoers to evolutionary ideas about race, ideas that were presented in a utopian context and often conveyed by exhibits that were ostensibly amusing. In many instances, human beings themselves were put on display, such as when the International Exhibition at Christ Church in 1906 paraded, quote, indigenous people as exhibits before the Anglo-Saxon populace, evidence of a little Pacific empire, end quote. Over the course of 3 centuries, from the 18th to the 20th centuries, the museum reified many racist and Orientalist stereotypes and tropes, often as part of a monolith narrative paying homage to its white foundations, art, and beginnings. And so, from the very outset, the museum was not inclusive of the experiences of peoples of color unless they were dictated by the European travelers or collectors themselves. Racialized knowledge-making moved beyond science to other forms as well, including eyewitness accounts from missionaries, colonial administrators, traders and travelers, anthropological writing, newspapers, novels, poems, and film, and with each source subsequently influencing museum, collecting, and exhibitionary practices. It's no wonder that Jesuits were seen as the earliest museum educators through their first use of the visual and optical formatting techniques that became commonplace in the new museum, as part of their programs of religious education, propaganda, and missionary work during the Counter-Reformation. It is significant that the earliest of museological practices were influenced by evangelical Jesuits whose own agenda of conversions of, quote, lower races was a critical element of 18th and 19th century settlement projects. These are the histories of the museum. These are the histories of colonialism, objects, storytelling from the gaze and lens of whiteness, privilege, and violence. As Linda Tuhiwai Smith has said, As a colonized person, the word research is inextricably linked to European imperialism and colonialism. This collective memory of imperialism has been perpetuated through the ways in which knowledge about Indigenous people was collected, classified, and then represented in various ways back to the West, and then through the eye of the West, back to those who have been colonized. Decolonization is about centering our concerns and our worldviews, and then coming to know and understand theory and research from our own perspectives and for our own purposes. Therefore, the need to tell our stories remains the powerful imperative of a powerful form of resistance. Now, let me tell you how that works for the range and breadth of different types of museums held within different structures in the Canadian context, because I know that a one museum size all model doesn't fit everywhere. On June 11th, 2020, news broke that former employees who were Black, Indigenous people of color had experienced racism at the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. Make no mistake, this is not abnormal. This is the norm. Canadians need to step off their self-righteous attitudes about Canada being a land of anti-racism, because our racism runs deep and far and we still haven't addressed it. We can't even call it out in Parliament, apparently, which is at the very heart of state-sanctioned racism historically. According to Timothy J. Stanley in his absolutely brilliant article, Why I Killed Canadian History, one of the central problems in anti-racism education is that of white denial. This phenomenon is particularly common in English Canada, where the myth that there is no racism endures. Whether in public controversy surrounding specific allegations of racist actions, in private conversations, or in academic studies, many people speak either of racism as existing elsewhere, so in the United States, for example, or of racist incidents in Canada as unfortunate exceptions to otherwise civilized and tolerant norms. People also speak of being tired of hearing about racism, implying that it is of marginal significance to their lives, or is something over which they have no control and for which they have no responsibility. By suggesting ways in which a particular form of racism came to be generalized, by showing how social geographies of race came to be, or how certain people's meanings came to be excluded, we can identify specific strategies to show how racism as both common and central to the lives of people in Canada. History as a discipline can shed light on these questions. The forms and types of racism in Canada, the ways in which racism in Canada has been or not been addressed in media, in museums, in textbooks, in academic circles, in the academy, in culture, is so entrenched, is so deep, that we don't even know the depths to which racism exists. That these past employees at the Canadian Museum of Human Rights have opened up about their experiences is absolutely no shock to me. Nor is it shocking, I'm sure, to every other BIPOC professional in this sector. I guarantee you that if you have one or two Indigenous, Black, people of color in your staff and who are permanent employees, that they have experienced pain, racist aggressions, not microaggressions, because there is nothing micro about white gaze, white condescension, white knowledge that attempts to delegitimize us in our lived power. I guarantee you, and please don't go asking your BIPOC staff members if that's how they feel. They are under no obligation to share anything with you. But because of Black Lives Matter, we have been given a platform from which to speak. I'm going to go back to me now. That platform is what has given me the strength and capacity to speak. So what are some of the problems that we have here in BC? Because I haven't experienced museum sectors in the rest of Canada, though I'm sure there is overlap. I'm going to discuss about 10 points today, so strap in. Firstly, the problems with the language of heritage. Because it's steeped in white heritage and settler white colonialism without any criticality of what that means to those of us who are the oppressed within that structure. So if you are a heritage organization, a heritage museum, you better get chatting really quickly on what you're going to do to dismantle your white colonial settler narratives. And I mean now. I mean with the images you have on display, with your community partnerships, the students you hire based on those Youth Canada work grants. I don't care. Dismantle your innate white settlerhood. What I'm sharing with you is not new information, it's not new knowledge, but it is knowledge that is not revisited when we have philosophical, meaningful conversations about museums, the power of museums, and why you all continue to only pander to whiteness. Number two, I want to speak about the interconnectedness of municipal and state-run museums, which are beholden to all or almost all white-run council and cities and mayors. Of course it's systemic. If cities are run by white people, how will they ever support and understand and fund the places of culture in their portfolio? Look at the city of Surrey. Look at the city of Abbotsford, my hometown. Both absolutely pathetic examples of understanding social justice, racism, anti-racism, privilege, and systemic white privilege. These municipalities are in charge of funding and understanding museums in their cities? Really? They are happy with a model of only white people signing up to do things because it perpetuates their power. The city of Abbotsford put out the most pathetic response to Black Lives Matter, a city that has a South Asian population of 22.7% and one councillor of South Asian descent. Somebody has to start the shift. Somebody in your museum sector has to use this moment we are in to challenge and change your inherent structures. The support will follow from Black, Indigenous people of color, but we aren't getting paid to be in those spaces, so you need to be the ones to do it. Not us, not yet. For large municipal museums, there's a symbiosis that needs to take place here. If you are working with your municipal and or state settings, now is the moment you can take to task your municipal leaders who are majority white. But you have a whole revolution behind you to support you. You have BIPOC on the ground in the professional spaces within organizations who will support you. But don't burden us, please. It has to be you who pushes the agenda. Demand more funds, and for the top CEOs in your organizations making $100 grand plus, adjust your budgets and take a pay cut. It won't kill you. Straight up, if the bottom line is always money, then create permanent line spaces for BIPOC artists, for BIPOC communications peoples, for BIPOC curators, artists, writers. Stop hiring us at contractual work, or even worse, making us do community work for free. We're worth more and we are demanding more. Number 3, when you do get grants to do digitization work, for the love of God, just stop spending more time and energy digitizing white settler European histories. We've got plenty of that, thank you very much. Build your archives and knowledge about your local BIPOC communities. Spend those grant funds to interview BIPOC elders in your community. Pay those knowledge holders, honor those knowledge holders, perpetuate and share those stories within your communities to show your actual investment in the work. Display them on your social media, display them on your websites and your platforms. I don't care if it takes years and years of you doing this until that community begins engaging with you. You have centuries worth of colonization and racism to account for. So yeah, it's gonna take time. Number 4, speaking of symbiosis, if there are granting agencies, arts councils, museums granting agencies, heritage granting agencies, please devote more and more funding only for BIPOC histories. Devote more than 1 or 2 sets of fundings for Indigenous-led projects. Devote funding to museums which demand that those museums will harness young BIPOC artists and grant them permanent positions. Hold museums accountable to be doing the work of harnessing their BIPOC-centeredness. You have the power to do this as granting agencies. Imagine if the Irving K. Barber digitization grant out of UBC, a grant that I think almost every museum seems to have received at one point or another, only made its grants available to those doing BIPOC histories. Imagine the incredible power and shifting priorities if they would do that. Number 5, symbiosis in terms of the archive. So I'm fully aware of the great controversy taking place, I don't know if it's across BC or nationwide, that the archives is going to be closed until a certain amount. I've received emails, petitions from my own department at UFE, from my department at UBC saying, sign this petition, we want to open the archives, blah, blah, blah. Can I tell you that as Black, Indigenous people of color, we don't give a shit that the archives is closed? Can I tell you why? The archives is an obsession with the English written word. The archive is an obsession with artifacts and objects and collections that are steeped in the history of colonialism, white supremacy, and museums through white gaze and white privilege. We are so tired of hearing that our stories don't exist, that our experiences don't exist, because the archives just aren't there for us. Because let me tell you, they do exist. We as BIPOC organizations have to spend about thousands upon thousands upon thousands of our own funds and utilize hours upon hours upon hours of our own time and emotion, whether earned through grants or otherwise, to forcefully interject ourselves into your all-white archives. Your white archives haven't even granted us the humanity of naming us. We are the nameless, which is a brilliant title that I take from my dear friends and colleagues of the Nameless Collective podcast, Milind, Paneet, and Naveen. If you don't know what this is, I really suggest you search it up right now, because it's the exact example of what BIPOC communities have to do just to be acknowledged piecemeal in your white historical memory? And who decided that archives should only be in English? Who decided that only the English language mattered in the archives? Who decided this? You decided this. Your institutions decided this. Where are the experiences of Chinese Canadians in the late 19th century in the archive in their own words? Where are they? Who's been hired within the archives to sustain that amazing piece of needed knowledge? I've been told by my colleague Beneath that even phone directories located in Vancouver, trying to name citizens in places in that time, don't even afford the naming of BIPOC citizens who lived in certain areas in Vancouver. Listing citizens, and even when an archive does name us, it's spelled wrong. So we have to do triple the amount of work to retrace those pasts. Once again, according to Timothy J. Stanley, who discusses scholars writing about Canada's history, quote, "In discussing the early history of Canada, it justifies exclusive reliance on European accounts on the grounds that written records are necessarily more reliable than oral histories. Its subsequent focus is almost exclusively on Europeans, their reasons for leaving Western Europe in the early modern period, the progress of European discovery and settlement, the road to Confederation and onwards. It ironically essentializes Europeanness. It is as if once Europeans arrive in Canada, they are frozen in time. Meanwhile, Aboriginal societies, which until the 19th century were the majority population in Canada, and which continue to occupy much of its landmass, are reduced to minor roles. After an initial account of Aboriginal societies, the histories refer to Aboriginal people only insofar as they interact with Europeans and European purposes. For example, their roles in Fur Trade Society or in the Riel Rebellion, or Elijah Harper's blocking off the Meech Lake Accord. Although both First Nations and Black African Canadians appear as the subjects of white racism, they are not discussed either as active participants in colonial society in their own right, or as peoples whose exclusion was integral to shaping that society." End quote. It's a long quote. The official archives play an incredible role in this erasure. We just finished a meeting here at the South Asian Studies Institute where somebody we had hired said that she personally had to go into community archives and go through every theme, every section, every image, just to find images of a Sikh turbaned man, because your search categories erase us. So even though we are there, we are erased by default through your search categories. Most recently, there was an announcement made by the Royal BC Museum about the releasing of 16,000 plus historical photographs depicting Indigenous communities from across BC that were taken. That's really great, wonderful. I wonder how many of those images afforded names and stories and humanity to the people being pictured. That is a problem with the archive, and we are trying to reclaim our namelessness through work being done like the Nameless Collective and many other organizations like my organization, the South Asian Studies Institute at UFE. But we have to find our own means to do it because you aren't doing it. Number 6, the obsession with objects. The obsession with objects and collecting needs to be done with. Get over it. Do you understand now how this is deeply insidious based on the history of what I just read out to you? Most, if not all, of the BIPOC communities who worked and built this country do not have the white settler historical privilege to have artifacts. We have had to shift and move from place to place to place to get jobs and employments in the sawmills, in the mines, on the farms, and that, too, at less than half the wage of their white counterparts received. Japanese Canadians had their entire assets, wealth, property stolen and taken and resold during World War II because of the racist Canadian government. South Asian Canadians and Chinese Canadians lived and worked in bunkhouses, not homes, shifting from place to place. Your demands for objects and artifacts reminds me of those histories, and it is an abusive act in itself. Stop forcing us to beg elders in our community for their precious few artifacts they may have. We don't need to give you shit. Think with innovation about how museums can decentralize the need for objects or offer something in lieu of objects. This was at the heart of the colonial project: the collecting, the displaying, the stealing, the demand, the pressure. Number 7, I want to speak briefly about small museums in BC, as I know there are many small museums in British Columbia. And of course, they're very different than the state-focused ones. You also still have a role to play in everything I've been speaking about today, as you have a role in serving your diverse communities. Perhaps a part of that is doing a whole survey of what your spaces look like from the inside out. How white is your museum in terms of its images and display? the stories being shared on your website and on social media. Perhaps begin there and work backwards to start to draw in and focus in on your communities. And perhaps from there, you can draw young BIPOC students to you. Draw them into history, heritage, archives, design, art, aesthetics. The small museum as a microcosm of larger systemic issues can potentially play an incredible role in enacting change. But you have to shift your entire worldview and lens to make that your sole purpose. Are some of you ready to do that? Number 8, de-Karenize your museums. I'm not quite sure what the cis hetero male gender equivalent would be. Maybe de-Brianize yourselves, since Canada has realized what a racist Bryan Adams is. But proportionately, we know that white women are working in museums as artists, curators, EDs, content writers, archivists, designers, etc. And some of you are the most Karenist bunch of people I've ever seen. And nothing is scarier than a Karen pretending to be a woke Karen. You all worry me the most. And I would say the same for white academics who are using this moment and race revolution to bolster yourselves. I don't see any of you highlighting the work of Black, Indigenous people of color or sharing their work on your social media platforms. That's a problem. So please look internally, reflect on what you're doing, how you come across when you speak, how you come across when you engage, because most of the time it's very transparent. Number 9, I've actually seen community-led exhibits run very successfully, and I want to take the time out to acknowledge that. I want to acknowledge the dear friendships I've forged with museum staff from those partnerships, and I want to thank those of you who have reached out to me personally, saying that you admire the work being done at the Sikh Heritage Museum in particular and the conversations taking place. But, the bottom line will always be that until you create the line items and systems in place to hire BIPOC across all sectors and the mechanisms in place to support them, so not the Canadian Museum of Human Rights model, your space will never be a space for us. I'm sorry, it just won't be. It just can't be. You need to come to terms with this. Your one-off exhibits about a certain BIPOC group are just not enough. If this is your place of understanding in this moment, then know that you have decided as an organization on the urgency of this work. We are living in 2020, and I'm still having to explain the position of white supremacy and longevities and continuities in the museum sector. We don't just want allies. In the words of Junie DeSalle, who spoke at a panel I moderated, we want accomplices. We want collaborators. And you don't get to decide if you're an ally. We as BIPOC get to decide if you're an ally. I'm almost at the end, so I'd like to read part of an email that my colleague and friend Mo Dollywell had written to Jack Lohman, the CEO of the Royal BC Museum. But I argue his email would be the same for what I feel about the Museum of Anthropology, the Museum of Vancouver. What else? What other major museums can we hold accountable here in BC? Just because we don't name you, it doesn't mean we don't see you. Quote, "The enemies are clear and actually require little energy from us. The issue is having such shitty friends. The issue is those professing allyship that act as an anesthetic, a buffer, a burden to progress because we are subject to their inertia. They provide the illusion of progress and keep us barbarians sedated. RBCM has professed allyship, and I've seen it in a few individuals we've had the pleasure of working with. But structurally, the message has been clear. The institution has its own priorities, and decolonization and anti-racism does not factor into those. Decolonizing projects actually seem to trigger an autoimmune response in institutions, slowly and steadily producing pathogens to inoculate the body of the virus. We are not a virus, but it is time to chop off some limbs. Every day that goes by like this is one more day that the RBCM or any other museum is complicit in white supremacy. Perhaps the leadership might think it takes time, but it takes infinitely longer when the leadership has nothing at stake. Literally no skin in the game. How many board seats will the RBCM be reserving for Indigenous representation, for people of color? Which board members will you be asking to step down to make this happen? How many roles are you committed to hiring in-house to have a balance and representation of the people you're supposed to be serving? How will you reallocate budgets to ensure all efforts are anti-racist, decolonized works? And most importantly, since the construct of race has become a reality we must face, and since RBCM exists as a cultural institution, how will you work to ensure that everyone in your institution is well-versed in critical race theory? That's the minimum requirement to have our humanity recognized. Hiring a brown person in accounting with a capitalistic worldview who has never grappled with internalized racism will most likely do more to reinforce the existing power structure. This is not justice. I'm actually ending on time. I want to end off with a picture of something and why I'm saying what I'm saying today and why we continue to do what we're doing today. This is a picture of my children. So my boys at the Sikh Heritage Museum, a National Historic Site of Canada, a fully functioning Gurdwara. And if you don't know what Gurdwara is, learn what Gurdwara is because you live in British Columbia. My boys in one of our earliest exhibits ever done on the left-hand side, and my boys on the right-hand side in another exhibit we did last year. I refuse to let my boys not see themselves reflected in your spaces. I refuse in 2020 to let my boys not think of themselves as having opportunities in your spaces. So if you're offended by my anger today, I don't care. Because my boys' safe space is the Sikh Heritage Museum. My boys' safe space is when we matha tek at the Gurdwara. My boys' safe space is when we see exhibits because it's done by us. We dictate who comes in. We dictate the panel pieces. We decide who we hire. And that is not fair. And on that note, I'm going to allow questions, I guess, because we have room for questions.
Thank you so much, Sharn. That was incredible. I remember hearing you speak for the first time 3 years ago and how inspiring and I want to say educational, but revolutionary it was. And I really appreciate you joining us here today and continuing with sharing your information with everyone who's also joined us. We do have some questions that I'd love to share, so I'll be reading them out for you. Our first question is from ICOM Canada, just asking if you would be able to make those points available for distribution in writing. Are you able to do that? Wonderful.
Definitely, because actually the piece about the historical foundations was one of my comprehensive examination questions. So I ended up managing to just slide that into this presentation, which is perfect. So I will definitely make that available. However, it could be a Word document, however people want to learn.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question here from Facebook Live. The question says, a lot to think about. Where do we begin? It's a big one.
You know what? I think, so first of all, you have to begin right now. And I think we have to put this as a top priority. My biggest fear, and those around me dealing with what we're dealing with emotionally, what's happening around us, is that this movement is going to die and go away. And we feel like a lot of people are waiting for it to go away. So I think a lot of museums, no matter what size you are, have to do an internal survey of what you have existing in this moment. It's almost like a survey of, like I said, what images you have on display, what images you have in your collections, what images and stories you make available online, because museums have showcased themselves in many different ways. So you have to do an internal survey of everything you have. And if you see that you are not doing a good enough, you're not representing your communities, your histories, that's going to be your second step. That's going to be on how you start diversifying your histories, devoting your grants and time and money to just doing those histories. The other thing is, I kept saying many, many times, don't lean on us because we're already burdened. And the thing is, if you already are set up to be able to be doing the work, if you've already got grants up the pike coming in or you're applying for grants, switch gears to focus only on the histories that represent your communities. Decide here and now what communities are missing in your spaces and what you're going to do to rectify that. It's going to take a bit of inertia where you begin the process, you start showcasing on social media that we're starting to do this, people will be drawn to you, but don't expect immediate results. It's going to take time. You're going to have students who may want to be drawn to you in different university spaces saying, hey, I see that you're doing this, I'd like to do a practicum here. You're going to have that happen like a magnet being drawn to you, but you have to do the work to look at what's wrong in your spaces first, do a survey, and then decide how are you as an organization going to put all focus on changing direction. I think for larger museums, a lot of the things that I talked about, like the obsession with the collections, the obsession with the archives, the obsession with, the collections in particular, that's a really deep philosophical conversation that I think needs to be had now, because I keep hearing, even in my own partnership work, where are the objects, where are the objects? At the Sikh Heritage Museum, we make do, thank you very much, without objects. We design around, we create our own object space. So I think larger museums have a philosophical conversation to sit down, innovate, and think, what are we gonna do if we're not displaying objects? So I think the initial survey needs to happen ASAP, and then decide where your priority is gonna shift. The hires that you currently have, how are you gonna shift their priorities as well?
Thank you. I do also want to share, as you may not be looking at the chat, but so many people here are agreeing with your points, thanking you, celebrating you. I appreciate, and I really especially love the one that says hashtag decentralize the need for objects. Fantastic.
Excellent. Yeah, definitely.
We have a question here from Elwyn. The Burnaby Village Museum flies the British Union Jack flag. Your thoughts?
The Burnaby Village Museum flies the British Jack flag?
Correct.
I don't even know what that is. What's the British Jack flag? What is that?
The British Union Jack is the flag that Canada would have flown in the 1920s due to imperial rule. That's not a history of. Yeah.
So he's a colonist. He's a colonist, an early 20th century colonist, potentially. Well, anyways, regardless, that's one of those internal surveys that needs to be done. And I want to make something very clear as well, as we're talking about controversies around flags and statues and monuments. The picture that was used for our white supremacy webinar today was a picture of one of those slaveholders in Europe whose statue was torn down. Very interestingly, the city, wherever that was, and forgive me, I can't remember right now, pulled the statue out and said, we want to put this in a museum. And my initial reaction was, hell no. Like, the fact that a museum is going to use this opportunity to, of something that's very visceral for many people, to put it in their space to profit off of potentially is exactly the problem with museums, right? Like for those of us, and especially Indigenous peoples on these lands who see statues of John A. Macdonald, who see these sorts of flags, you cannot even imagine the amount of pain, the amount of emotional trauma they feel. And I don't want to speak for Indigenous peoples. I can tell you that I feel it as somebody who knows those histories. Every time I walk by and see a statue, every time I see a street name, our workplace is on the corner of King and Mackenzie. That's a problem. I don't even know if it's named after like the actual racist leaders, but you know, King and Mackenzie. Every time you go by these places as Black Indigenous people of color, it's actually harming to us. It's not this kind of symbolic gesture of a statue. So back to the Burnaby Village Museum question, that's going to be part of their internal exercise to say, what are we going to do with this flag? How do we not just remove it and erase the fact that it existed, acknowledge that it was put up here as a part of a systemic problem in our institute, and we're working to change that. So that's what I would recommend.
Thank you. And again, I just want to say I really appreciate you laying out the steps of what we can do next and where we can go from here.
Yeah. I just want to say as well, this is just my opinion, and I'm very careful. There are knowledge holders, amazing professionals, amazing artists who are Black and Indigenous and people of color beyond me. And so as I say this, I want to be careful to say it's not our job to burden people, to demand answers on what to do. The next step question puts a lot of weight on us, right? But I also want to acknowledge these are my opinions, right? I'm informed by what I've seen over only the past 7 years in particular that I've been in this work, and my PhD happens to be doing this work. So there are people who may have different opinions, and that's okay. I am not a homogeneous representation of what I believe in. There are people who may have different opinions. So that's really important.
Thank you. I do want to add, there is a comment from our Facebook live stream saying, quote, Sharn isn't just saying what she feels, she's saying what we all feel. She just happens to be brave enough to do it for us, end quote.
Thank you. I would like a copy of this chat. Maybe I'll put it up on my wall and put it like as a plaque so I can keep being reminded of the work to be done.
Absolutely. Write it on your bathroom mirror so that you can read it every morning. I'm encouraging everyone to put that on your bathroom mirror.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
We do have a question here from Eric. He would just love if you could expand. I think you said Karenist or Karenisms. I don't think he's familiar with the Karen meme. Sure. If you're able to elaborate on that.
So, there's actually a lot of, Eric, I would recommend just Googling it. There's been amazing articles written about the culture of Karen and what the culture of Karen represents. The culture of Karen represents white, cis, female, hetero privilege. The culture of Karen represents assumptions. The culture of Karen represents condescension. The culture of Karen represents this innate arrogance. And it's become this phenomenon, especially on social media, where we're calling out Karens. We're calling out Karens within our own academics. We're calling out Karens within the museums. My personal experience is that there are a lot of Karens in the museum culture, and I don't understand why. And the scary thing is, as I said, there are Karens who are pretending to be woke. And that's that real internal dialogue we all need to be having within ourselves. With Black Lives Matter, I've been having internal dialogues with myself and my community and the people in my home and around me about anti-Blackness in South Asian culture, right? We all need to have these internal philosophies and dialogues with ourselves before we can project anything outwards. We can't even begin to project or assume or know anything until we look internally. Why are we here? What are we trying to do? What is our goal? Who are we harming in the process? Or who do we want to bring into our fold mindfully? And so, Eric, definitely Google it. The Karen culture is pretty amazing. I saw a few chat people who said, yeah, de-Karenize the museum. So a lot of people are aware of what I mean. It's very millennial Generation X centric, definitely, the term.
Thank you. This is a question from Facebook. It says it's a long but interesting question. It starts off saying, thank you for this amazing talk. It's been my experience working in some previous small museums where largely white boards of directors exert control over exhibitions, programming, and services, that there is no opportunity to change an institute's practices, even over the long term. We are beholden to board of directors as per the BC Societies Act. The problem is that these boards are often drawn from white families who have a vested interest in maintaining the museum's collections and programming that idolizes their ancestors. I wonder if there's a crisis in governance in our sector which prevents us from even engaging in these important discourses of indigenizing, de-Karenizing, and including more BIPOC content.
Oh, that's such a good question. So he mentioned the BC Societies Act, or what was the act? Or she
the BC Societies Act.
BC Societies Act. So excellent question. I think, firstly, we can't work from a place of that's a wall, and therefore how do we can't jump over it. That wall needs to be torn down. And in terms of a governance structure, if it's the BC Societies Act that dictates that boards are made a certain way, then we need to target the BC Societies Act. I think, I picked on municipalities as well, right? And the letter I read out called out Royal BC Museum's board. I think there is opportunity in this moment to have people step aside. Like, I don't know the governance structures or the models that can allow this to happen, but I think we have a movement behind us where we can shift and change board structures within municipal spaces. Part of the problem, of course, is that municipal spaces, like I said, are elected, right? The election process is what puts these people in positions of power, and so they therefore perpetuate the same structures and models within museums for those that run the museums. So there is no easy answer. I still think that there are internal surveys that can be done in your museums. You can still do the good work, even though you may not be able to get at those board if they are elected, right? If they're elected through the municipalities. I think you as museums still have the capacity through grants, like I've mentioned, through utilizing grants and only focusing on stories that you are missing and erasing and omitting right now. I think there are ways to move around it, and to just say that there's a wall that we can't get over requires more innovation and thought behind that, because that's part of the problem. The moment a wall is faced, we give up so easily. And I don't think giving up is an option anymore. I don't think just saying that, well, it's an electoral process, it's a governance problem, and leaving it at that is gonna solve anything. We have to work with what we can. But that was a great question. Makes me think a lot as well.
Thank you. I agree. We have a question here from Melissa. Any tips on how a white person can present the stories of BIPOC sensitively, how you could present stories of BIPOC being sensitive to not coming across as insulting or condescending?
So my short answer is, I don't think you can. That's my short answer. And what I'm trying to get at is to push our thought and push our evolution beyond just thinking that still only white people can tell the stories. Like, we are no longer in this space. That is no longer an option, right? You have to put the structures and systems in place that will allow BIPOC people to do these stories and share these stories and be paid for it and be paid permanently. So that's my short answer. I think my long-term answer is that, like I said, I've worked in, like, if I can say, the Museum of Surrey, right? I was on the advisory committee where they did this, and they did a whole exhibit on Punjabis and the history of Punjabis in Surrey. And it was done really well. I attended meetings where it was only, those of us who were of Punjabi descent speaking on the panel, and we were heard. I felt we were heard. I've also attended these same sorts of meetings in other museums where I'm not heard, right? That's the Karen culture coming in, where people around me are trying to share stories and we're getting interrupted. We're being told what should be done. We're getting interrupted with insertion of their stories. That is not a model. Just listen to what we have to say. We may disagree with each other as an advisory. We probably will disagree with each other as an advisory. We may be all over the place. We may not respond to your emails. We may not come to every advisory committee meeting. But you have to understand why. Going back to, those spaces aren't made for us. So short term, there are ways that can be done. Long term, my answer is it can't be done anymore. You need to hire us holistically, either, and not just as curators. Museum worlds have amazing kind of circles of opportunities beyond just curation, right? There's design, there's aesthetics, there's art, there's, many other opportunities. So you have to hire us. And you have to look at your HR practices that are boxed in such a way and are problematic that by default, Black, Indigenous, people of color always somehow manage to be excluded in your HR processes. And the same is for universities. It's an HR problem everywhere in terms of racism. It will always somehow exclude Black or Indigenous people of color. So that's also a systems review of your HR practices. When you do these calls for artists, what are you looking for? What are you prioritizing? And why is it that always the people of color seem to be eliminated? So once again, it's not an easy question, and therefore I can't give an easy answer. And it's 101. I'm so sorry. I just keep going on.
That's okay. It's super fantastic and engaging and fantastic. If anyone does have to head out, as it is 1 o'clock, the recording of this webinar will be in your inboxes shortly. It will be available on our Facebook page as well as on our YouTube channel. I have one last question for you from our chat here. Thank you for this fantastic talk. It was incredibly insightful and useful in thinking about how we can move forward. do you have any tips on how emerging and or new museum workers, examples being recent graduates, those entering into the sector, can advocate for BIPOC and BIPOC culture, especially when we may have limited power to exercise within our institutions?
Oh, you know, it'd be amazing if we had a BIPOC caucus of artists in British Columbia. Man, that would be amazing. I don't know if that exists. Like BIPOC museum professionals. Like, I just wonder, I'm totally thinking out loud with the BC Museums Association, if that's something we could harness and talk about. Because I know from my experiences here at the university where I work, these 2 weeks, being amongst people of color who've experienced and just get it the instant we lock eye to eye has been the most powerful driving force of my energy in the past, and others around me. It's energy driving, it sustains us, it keeps us grounded, it keeps us going. So I'm just thinking out loud, that would be amazing. And somebody recommended even Artists of Color BC Facebook group, or, you know, a place where we can support each other. So that's just one idea. That would be amazing.
Thank you. I just made a jot down here on my actions list, BIPOC Museum Professional Channel. How can we make that happen? So that's definitely something that I'd like to connect with you further about. Carolyn did add into the chat that there is an Artist of Color BC Facebook group that exists.
Wonderful. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. And
Thank
you know,
you.
I think we may want to change that, not just to be artists, but be museum professionals. Like, because I think artists, amazing, that's great that there's a separate Artists of Color, but museum professionals encompass so much. And then it becomes a space where young and burgeoning people coming out of grad school can find this place and say, oh, there's a place for me. Maybe they can guide me on where to apply and what to do. So maybe making it a museums of color professional space. Just
absolutely. I do want to add, I have seen something circulating online where it is encouraging emerging professionals or people that are changing jobs or in the job hunt, when it comes to the point in the interview where they ask you if you have any questions for the organization, that's the opportunity where you can ask, what are you doing to ensure that BIPOC voices are being heard? How are you reaching out? Or any of those questions to make sure that it's being representational. And that's something that you can embark on as an emerging professional. Sharn, I wanted to leave the last words with you, so it's all you.
I wanted to, the ending was supposed to be the picture of my boys, right? We all love pictures of our kids, so that was going to be my like sentimental end note. I think I would just like to end by saying that there are humans who are being impacted by your work, by your professionalism, by your institutions. And we need to understand what that means in terms of our emotional investment. We want to be in the museums. We want to be reflected. We want to be a part of the process. We want to be acknowledged, because culture has power. Culture can change for good. Culture can change for longevity. And so just the urgency of the work, get on it, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful afternoon and take care.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, everybody.